because there was one time I was going to go and do a training course. It was a week's training course, and just before the very first session, I disappeared off to the gents, okay, and I washed my hands, okay, but the bowl in the gents was literally a bowl, okay, and I turned on the tap, the water hit the bowl, round up, and straight onto front of my trousers. And I was wearing light coloured trousers, so I had this big wet patch just here. I was standing there going, what? How can I go and stand in front of a class of people with great big wet trousers here? So I don't know, have any of you heard of Mr. Bean? Yeah? Have you seen the one where he goes to the hand dryer and he's there trying to get the hot air dry? I was like that, so I was hoping nobody came in as I was doing this. But now, that's a risk for me that I have to consider every time I do a training course. What's the bowl like in the toilets? I don't want to get all wet to get down there. I'm all right today, I'm safe. But this is all we have to think about, the risk of things that could happen. Okay, so when we're looking at risks from the ground up, there's a few examples of some risks that we can look at. So we've got the good old mouse up there. We've got some risks for the poor little kid. I don't know what's going to happen there. That is from Germany. So yeah, big risk if you're going to be anyone involved in that. I love this one. Caution, this sign with sharp edges. Do not touch the edges of this sign. So why is the sign there in the first place? It's just telling us about it. All sorts of risks. And actually, if you just put risk into Google and put up images, these are the sorts of things that you get. Every day, you're going to be faced with risks. There's this one, I don't know if you can read this. It says, aside from praised sheep now and then, this is a very risk-free profession. And it makes you think about risks in your job. I mean, I think about the risks involved in my job, what I do, going out to the client sites. And I can always remember when I was working with Grove, doing all the teaching, the certification and everything, somebody said to me, there is a risk that you, as a trainer, could get sued. And I said, how come? And I said, well, when you're teaching, you know, you're telling people what they should be doing in terms of test design techniques, power culture, metrics, etc., etc. If someone goes back to their office and does that work, and they get something wrong in their application, they get sued by their customer because they didn't get the right level of coverage, then you give them the wrong information. And that set me thinking, oh, goodness me. And I actually even contacted insurance companies and said, you know, is there a way I can use an insurance policy in case I tell somebody something wrong, they do something wrong at work and they sue me? And they said, you're okay. Because people have a choice. You can tell people what should actually happen, but at the end of the day, if they go back and don't implement or implement in a different way in their company, that's their choice. So in fact, it wasn't a risk for me. I was, phew. But that's something to think about. You know, when we're telling people what to do, you know, there's an inherent risk there as well. So it made me think that, or maybe my job is not quite so risky. There are risks associated with my job, I guess, in travelling. But if you look at different professions, I think to myself, well, doctors, pilots, the risk associated with that. I mean, from a doctor's point of view, they get somebody coming into accident to the emergency. They have to make, you know, literally life or death decisions. The risk of getting it wrong is colossal. I would hate that stress, I really would. Some people thrive on it. Have any of you, do you remember the Challenger Space Shuttle disaster, where it blew up on takeoff, and it's because of these O-rings that failed? It's really interesting because there's a program on the Discovery Channel about what happened on that particular flight. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but they were saying that it was the O-rings that failed, and the reason they had O-rings is because the solid fuel bottle boosters were too big to be made in one piece. They were like two tubes joined together, and then they had these big O-rings holding them together. Now what had happened was the night before the flight, it was a very, very cold night, And the people who made these boosters were really worried that they'd never tested anything from going so cold to takeoff temperature before. And to them, there was a risk that these O-rings would fail. And there were signs that these O-rings had got brittle over years. Now, as it turned out, NASA had delayed the launch of the space shuttle I think 3 times due to bad weather. And they didn't want to delay it a 4th time because they said it would look stupid. So they put pressure on the manufacturers of these solid fuel rocket boosters to say, yeah, it's acceptable, let's go with it. So they launched, and we know what happened. It was catastrophic. Now, what I looked at that point was risk. NASA had looked at what is the risk of us not launching, and they said it looked stupid. But if on the other hand they looked and said, what is the risk of launching and it failing, that should have been enough to say, well, let's not do this. Now, they actually introduced a new safety features after that because they said that if there was any engineer at any stage of the pre-flight of the shuttle, they said they were concerned about it, they could actually stop the flight. It's a shame they had to bring that in after that disaster. But it's really interesting because I'd seen that Discovery Channel programme a second time. And you know whenever you read a book or you see a movie, you get more out of it the second time. Well, the second time I saw this programme at it, they said that when the space shuttle was going to be launched, they had 700 risks they had to mitigate. And if any one of those risks matured, it was disaster. And I was thinking to myself before that, well, you know, going into space, yeah, it'd be quite fun actually, quite interesting. And then all of a sudden you think, hang on, 700 risks, and any one of those could be disaster. All of a sudden it starts to focus the mind a little bit. So risk is, you know, a big aspect that we need to bear in mind now. So it makes me think, yeah, my job is relatively risk-free by comparison with other organisations and other people. I don't know how you feel about it. Now, what I'd like to do is just jot down on your notes just a few words what you think risk is. And I'm not saying it's going to take 10 minutes, but just think about risks in your everyday situation. Think about the risks that you had to contend with from the moment you woke up this morning to get in here. There was possibly even a risk that your alarm didn't go off in the morning to wake you up to get here in time. But just think about the risks that you had to face, whether you came by car, whether you walked, public transport. And think what risk is. The likelihood of something actually happening, or the probability of something going wrong, and the impact on us or other people. And that's what we have to consider all the time. So, just put up here the chance that something could go wrong in the future, resulting in undesired consequences. That's a very simple sort of approach. Now, sometimes we talk about issues as well, but an issue is different because an issue is actually a risk that's matured, i.e. something has gone wrong. So we could have a risk in our project that the test environment won't be ready for us to start our testing on Monday. And we need to think about that. We need to plan and prepare for that eventuality. We need to think what could go wrong, and then what we're going to do to try to prevent it happening, or do to sort it out when it actually does happen. And when we get to Monday morning, and the test environment is not available, that's no longer a risk, that becomes an issue. In other words, it's happened, it's doing it now, and we need to do something about it. If that actually happened, and you came to me and you said, Clive, yeah, the test environment, we did think there might be a problem with some Monday, and sure enough, yeah, it's not working. So my next question is going to be, so what are you going to do about it? How are you going to sort it out? And what I wouldn't expect anyone to say to me is that, I'll have a think about it, I'll come back to you. No, we knew about this could be a possibility. So what are we going to do about it now? We've got to take some action. Now, risk-based testing, the ICQB definition here, is an approach to testing to reduce the level of product risks and inform stakeholders on their status Starting in the initial stages of the project, it involves the identification of product risks and their use to guide the test process. Now, this is where we're talking about product risks. When we do TMI assessments, we look at risk, and risk is in many, many different areas of the organisation. But as you know, there are two different types of risks we have to look at: project and product risk. And I find it very surprising, the number of organisations I go to who don't split them out. They just say risks. And actually they are different, subtly different, and we have to deal with them in different ways. So it's really useful to know what the difference is and to identify those and deal with them accordingly. So a project risk, just for clarification, is the risk of something actually happening within the project. So there's a risk that the software may come late into testing. There's a risk that the environment won't be ready on Monday. There's a risk to some milestones within the project. And to resolve those and to mitigate those, we take management action. So we can either de-scope the project, we put more resource on it, we change the deadline dates or target dates. Management action deals with that. Product risk, what we're talking about here, is what is the risk of the product or the application that you're developing failing when it goes live? So if you've got a risk that the application you're developing is not going to work as fast as you expect it to work, the performance isn't as good as you're expecting, you have to do some performance testing to see if it's a problem or not. So product risk, we mitigate that by doing testing. We check it out and see if it is a problem. Now, we can get a project risk that could lead to a product risk. So for example, you could have a project risk where your lead tester could leave the company. Okay? That's an issue that can actually affect milestones and the deliveries within the project. But the result of that could be that insufficient testing is done, or not the right level of testing is done, which could affect the products later on. So there is a distinction between the two, and we need to be very clear that when we record the risks, that we record them as a project and product, because they're dealt with in different ways. So we're looking at the approach to reduce the level of product risks, inform stakeholders, and stakeholders are going to be defined as anybody who's got an interest in the application that's being developed. On their status, regarding the initial stage of the project, so it involves the identification of risks and use to guide the test process. So we're going to be using these risks then to prioritise the testing we're doing. We're going to be producing metrics which talk about the risks so that the stakeholders can make informed decisions based on that as well. So the whole load of stuff around risks. So risk now is quantified by what we call as risk exposure. And it's simply defined as the probability or likelihood multiplied by impact. Now I know that there's some people probably just do a straightforward calculation. So if you have category 3 likelihood or probability and a 3 for impact on risk, then you just do a 3 by 3 gives you 9. But I'm going to show you a grid later on which gives a slightly different weighting to the impact of the risk. Because you need to be a little bit more focused in the way that we look at the risk exposure. And basically, the higher that number, the more focus we have to deal with to mitigate that risk. So the risk exposure is going to help us focus the testing effort, what we're going to be actually looking at. Now when we're looking at risks, I know within the test plan template, based on all the standards, it talks about identifying risks and issues and assumptions within the test plan. But I would not personally record all the individual risks in the test plan, for the simple reason that risks are constantly changing. We identify new risks, some risks will disappear. So we're constantly updating that table of risks. And in theory, every time we update that table in the test plan, we need to reissue that test plan to others for review or sign-off. Not really an appropriate thing to do. So what we actually do is keep our risks recorded in a separate risk register, or we call it the RAID log. And the RAID log stands for risks assumptions, issues, and dependencies. So it can either be something like a RAID log, or it can be something like a risk register. And what we're trying to do there is identify whether it's product or project risks. We need to understand who is the owner of the risks. Every risk needs to have an owner who's going to be watching it and monitoring it. And if there's something going to kick off that risk to take some action, we need to identify. So we're going to be tracking these risks all the time. And the normal thing to do is review the RAID log or the risk register at maybe the weekly project managers meeting and have a discussion about where we are with the outstanding risks and what new ones have been discovered. It'd be great if we knew all the risks up front, start of a project, but we don't. There are new risks that get discovered as we go along doing the work. It's like, on your journey to work, or if you're travelling somewhere, you've got some risks you can identify. If you're travelling off on holiday, there's a risk you might turn up at the railway station or the airport at late. Yeah, but there's other risks that will actually happen once you get there, you actually start seeing it. There's a risk when you get there, the gate may change, or you might go to a different gate or something like that. Or you might get stuck in a big queue of traffic. There's things that can happen and they can wrong, so it's very dynamic. Now, in the test plan, I say it talks about having risks in there, but what I'd actually have in there is a statement which says how a risk will be dealt with. In other words, it's the process of managing risks. You might have a separate risk process document, but you're going to be actually saying how are you going to be handling risks in the test plan. You may even have a high-level statement of how you're going to deal with and mitigate risks. But say the actual individual risks I would hold in a separate register. And those risks need to be visible to everybody in the project. I know sometimes the project managers have their own little risk register for project risks. And then sometimes you have a separate one for testing. Why? Let's put them all together, because all risks associated with the project it's not like any of them are secret. Because we want to know what's actually happening, more transparency. And maybe there's some things that testers could do which help the project risks, the risks identified within the project itself. Okay, so the RAID log. We've got the risks identified in there, and I would actually have a column in there when you talk about those, which identify them specifically as whether they're project or product risks. I was at a client site last week doing a TMI assessment, and they've got a RAID log, and their risks were categorised as project or system integration testing. And I thought, that's a specific one. But I realised what they're saying is, where is this risk going to be found? Is it in the project, or is it going to be found in testing? They didn't identify it as a project risk or a product risk. And when I spoke to them about it, they saw what they had to do, so they were going to add another column in there to specify exactly what it was, because that would help them then with their mitigation. Assumptions. Any factors that you're assuming to be in place that will contribute to the successful results of your project. The log includes details of the assumption, the reason it is assumed, and the action needed to confirm whether the assumption is valid. Now, assumptions, we have to take all the time in testing. We don't always know categorically the answer, so we have to assume certain things. Now, in English, if you split out assume, you can see it says it makes an ass of you and me. All right? In other words, it makes a fool of you and me. So if we assume things, it can make a fool of us. It can be made to look stupid. So when we have to assume anything, I would say always write it down and say exactly what your assumption is. Then someone can come back to you and say, yeah, your assumption is right, or no, you misunderstood this, and actually it should be this, this, and this. But what you're doing is making clear what you think is happening in the absence of anything specific. So don't just think or assume that you got it right and everyone else has got it wrong, okay? Because people will have different perceptions. The issues, something that is going wrong on your project and it needs managing. Failure to manage issues may result in poor delivery or even failure. The log includes descriptions of each issue, its impact, its seriousness, and actions needed to contain and remove it. Can be a mature risk. Yeah. So what I said, what it's saying is that something we were expecting to happen, and guess what? It's actually happened. So we deal with it now. But it's no longer a risk. Dependencies, any event or work that is either dependent on the results of your project or on your project,